Hello, welcome back to Zero Books. My name is Kyle. Thank you so much for joining us. Our guest today is Jason Bahbak Mohaghegh, a philosopher, translator, associate professor of comparative literature at Babson College, and the, if I might say, prolific author of a haul of books, I would say, that thematically address topics of mania, apparition, violence, cruelty, madness, silence, apocalypticism, demonology, the literature and art forms of antiquity, modern art, poetry, architecture, most importantly, inventive explorations of Eastern and Western literary forms, subjects, and ideas. And if you can believe it, I could go on. He's joined us today to discuss volume 2 of his book, Night. And this volume 2 is subtitled A Philosophy of the Last World. The first volume of Night was released by Zer0 in 2020. And volume 2 arrives later this summer. Very excited to have him here to discuss and interrogate the imaginative possibilities of my own personal insomnia. Jason, welcome back to the show. Very nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be speaking with you today, and thanks to everyone who might listen in.
Very exciting. We'll get into your book and discuss that in more detail here soon, but I think for viewers who aren't familiar with your work, the best way to introduce them is for you to introduce yourself, the types of work that you're interested in, the kinds of topics that have interested you as a scholar, and how all of this possibly relates to anything that you're currently working on, or, just like let everyone get to know you a little bit and, why you do this kind of a thing. So take it away.
Well, actually, I think that I can give a sense of my approach, which is that a lot of twists and turns, a lot of sort of contortions along the way. Usually, by the way, I do start, as you noted, then I select a kind of conceptual password to chase, and then I try to unlock all the corridors to it. So my first book was on chaos, second book was on violence, then silence, then illusion or disappearance, and sort of I go to different sort of thematic territories and I try to find whatever intriguing artifacts, strange archives that for me are at least obscure and mesmerizing in some way. And then using a versatile and sort of far-reaching assortment of methods, philosophy, literature, mysticism, sometimes different anthropology, and sort of the most experimental, cutting-edge forms of cultural studies that I can come up with. And just in order to take it from different angles and vantage points. And that's actually even how this book began. This was interesting because it was almost a matter of unfinished business, this book on Night, this two-volume project on Night that you mentioned, because my fascination with the concept actually came across, there are three dimensions to it. There's kind of a triple answer to how this book began as an example of a lot of how my books are generated. And the answer extends across both the creative, the destructive, and the neutral. And what I mean by that is that for years, I was intrigued by collecting some of the most entrancing textual samples that I could find from remote domains, hidden writings of stonecutters, mirror makers, apocalyptic poets, people disappeared at sea. And I kept noticing this recurring detail of how often these states of exception transpired at night. But it was always just a backdrop for me. It was always just sort of an atmospheric, incidental thing until I started to focus on it. And I realized there are even many nocturnal sub-traditions that I discovered from various cultures and civilizations across time periods and geographical borders, these worlds of ideas and sensoriality where night was always the chosen theater of operation. So, for instance, I met a great, brilliant classical Persian musician once who taught me that there were certain rare musical modal systems that can only be played in Persian music at specific post-midnight hours. It's not allowed by the sort of the classical guilds to play them in the light of day. Then I discovered that the Japanese have forms of poetic formulations that can only be recited in like the deepest night intervals. Moroccans have practices of forbidden storytelling that can only be done at night. Eastern European folklore has 1,000 references and allusions to creatures who are possible only as nocturnal beings, and so I noticed these highly acute differences and that each one of them had their own typologies of sound, image, language, tone, mood that accompanied these experiments with dark durations of experience. So that's just a kind of example of how it began. But to say this, that on the creatives, I said that the way that this book even started, that you began with, had a creative, destructive, and a neutral association. What I meant by that was that the more obscure creative spheres of consciousness and imagination I just mentioned, musicians and artists and poets, that became a gateway into exploring night as a singular creative territory. But then on the destructive side of the game, if anyone's ever looked at any of my work, some of my earlier books were dedicated to factions and movements of violence, as you mentioned. And I was searching to develop a philosophy of cruelty there. And it was in some rougher places where I traveled throughout the world, some back alleys that are better left unspoken, that I noticed a unique existential relationship that these groups of that were violent, thieves, I talked to thieves, smugglers, dealers, extortionists, even assassins, and I noticed that they would gather and circulate their trades at night. So that was the destructive dimension of that. And I also became interested, as you know from reading the book, in an ancient concept of the night raid. You know, a lot of people forget Western literature, so-called Western literature, the canon begins with the Iliad. And presumably, I mean, that's kind of an artificial origin point, but if we take that, it culminates with a night raid, with Odysseus's sort of Trojan horse scheme that allows people to cut throats in the middle of the night. And so I saw this, by the way, the term for night raid in Persian, which I like even better, is shabihun, which means blood night. And it means this form of asymmetrical warfare where just, you steal into enemy camps and sort of do this nightmarish gesture. So that was the destructive side of night. And finally, and then I'll stop talking in this first overture, there was a neutral dimension. I was always curious, probably most of all, more than even the creative and the destructive figures, in deciphering the consciousness of those who dabble in estrangement, distance, indifference, coldness, radical calmness. And so that's a third alliance that takes no ideological side in the world, seems to have no stake in the origin or future of things, ethereal, cryptic type silhouettes who no judgment, no psychology, no delusions of subjectivity. These, for example, wanderers, amnesiacs, sleepwalkers, assassins, again, can sometimes be that way, or mercenaries can sometimes be that way. And so they also all really sort of do their business at night. So those are the neutrals. So I had the creative, the destructive, and the neutrals. I thought I have to try and answer this question and engage with why night is such a rich terrain for these different modalities. So
it's interesting to think about the sort of internal planes of reflection from as you penetrate into night, which is something that it's a sense of absolute enclosure. I think that people have a popular understanding of night, right? It's there and it's enclosed, in what is contained within it is this sort of cosmic negativity that doesn't produce useful ways of seeing and thinking. But what you sort of purport is that it's the inverse of that. Night almost paradoxically expands inquiry within what many see as sort of forces of enclosure. And I find interesting that the sort of productive force of night is not it's not a change of how we understand night necessarily. It's the context by which we experience night that is placed into conversation with destructive, productive, and neutral forces. Makes me think a lot about the construction of our conception of history and how you're so effectively able to marry sources from antiquity, more contemporary forms of literature that many may not be necessarily familiar with, be them in terms of form or geographically, and to use that to create images of the future. I've just wondered what your experience has been marrying those types of sources together, in a creative way.
well, I would get in trouble. There's an idea behind that. It's a very selected technique that goes to a kind of idea of the immanence of thought, which is to say that if you do your job right, you should be able to read Henri Michaud or Una Kazern as if they were artifacts of an ancient civilization from 5,000 years ago or from an alien race 5,000 years from now. That's what Nietzsche calls the untimely. Not every author can achieve or conquer that, but my favorite sources tend to have that quality where they escape contextualization or reduction to their time and space and culture and identity in a way. And there's a sort of mastery of the enigmatic there. And so being able to jump or to fuse, as you said, in a kind of convolution or witch's cauldron, all these different time periods and images. If I were trying to establish them as linear dominant genealogies, then I would be in error, because there is no obvious teleological connection between, let's say, an ancient Egyptian goddess of night and Blade Runner's portrayal of the future as permanent midnight.
Right.
You know, I mean, they're different. I mean, entirely different epocalities. They're different concepts of paradigms of the body and of knowledge and of knowing. If I take this seriously, that every kind of, there are these epistemes in which even what it means to know means different things. You can't just
Right.
conflate them. But I never do that. I try to find these very slight bridges or connective kind of tissues between them. You know, these fine strands that are not the dominant connection, but are the minor connection, or the sort of the more elusive way that you slip from one forest to another one, sort of. It's kind of how the logic of the fairy tale works. What's the connection between Alice's, Mad Hatter and the opium smoking caterpillar and the Cheshire cat? Nothing, presumably, except that they're all objects of fascination, and somehow they contribute together to creating the carnivalesque environment of Wonderland. You know, they produce an atmosphere, a kind of unifying atmosphere in their radical difference from one another. And so that's part of the method. Again, if it fell into the wrong scholarly hands, I'd get whipped for some of the moves that I make, for sure, of jumping between periods. But like I said, it's almost the way, this is going to sound like a provocative or a dangerous connection, but schizophrenia often has a symptom called apophenia,
Mm-hmm.
which is the projection of patterns into otherwise meaningless phenomena. So almost the child's version of that is pareidolia, which they see like a rabbit in a cloud. But the more paranoiac or obsessive version of that in schizophrenia is to see like numbers, numerological messages in the newspaper, and then it comes from some mysterious overlords, or it's tied to some kind of conspiratorial thing. I playfully enact that, willfully
Mm-hmm.
and consciously enact that sometimes to see how things can transmit. But again, it has to be the right choices, the right matrix, sort of. It doesn't work just to throw everything together. But to the second point, rather to the originally first point you made, which I thought was wonderful. It always stuck with me, that the resonance and the echo of Nietzsche's comment, night too is a sun. And so when you said that darkness can be
Right.
illuminating, or darkness can be profoundly generative and productive, way before Nietzsche, mystics knew that.
Yeah.
Mystics understood how the states of oblivion, states of forgetting, states of trance, ritual trance, how the dark was productive. But we could even flash forward to a very material thing. In the 1960s, they were experimenting with sensory deprivation tanks,
Right.
not far from where you are in Massachusetts at Harvard University. And they were
Right.
putting graduate students at the time, in these pitch black, soundproof sort of capsules filled with a little
Some
bit of
things have
water.
never changed,
It's exactly there you go. And the sensory deprivation things, what you learn very quickly, what they didn't even need to study it in much depth. Within minutes, you start to have vivid hallucinatory sort of images just come right before the eyes. And so that shows you how the dark, or the nothingness, or the night is not just pure absence, pure void, but it's, again, rich terrain for just phenomenal emergencies. Lastly, I'd just say this, any kid, any child who's left alone to spend the night at their house a little bit too young, a little bit too early, they always think they're ready for it, and the parents give them that shot. And then every creak in the wall, every
That's right.
floorboard that makes a slight noise becomes a catapulting movement to a thief, a clown, a horrific being that's going to storm.
That's right.
And the parents come home eventually and find them barricaded in a room with, baseball bats and a million weapons surrounding them. The imagination just goes into overdrive, goes into a kind of excessive, ecstatic outpouring of possibilities because of the dark, because of the presumed absence of things. So, yeah, I think it has a spontaneous ability to produce just wonderment as well.
An intuitively paradoxical object, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, I believe. Um,
Sounds like me, sure.
So, not just in night, but throughout your work, you employ very unique prismatic constructions. The term that I've used is thought images, but feel free to correct me. As a kind of philosophical language. For example, the beginning of both volumes of Night begin with a series of what you refer to as principles. In the case of volume one, dark paradoxes. So, night as universal overthrow, night as fatal wager, as creational error, as objective solipsism, etc. And in the case of volume two, which I thought very interesting, 8 principles by nightfall, which include sort of ruminations on night as mood. I believe you referred to night as the master of moods, which I thought was very poetic. Night as a distortional space, that's right. Forbidden aesthetic, night as myth, etc. I know that in other places in your work, you've constructed sort of similar for lack of a better term, exercises or images or sort of constructions. And my question, I guess, is what is the role of these thought images in the construction and interpretation of night? And potentially, how has this sort of this point of inquiry, this way of writing, if you will, influenced your work? And how has it affected the way that you sort of see your scholarship?
Well, thank you for asking that, because that gets to actually one of the things that I get to rarely speak about. And to me, it's so crucial. And it's how I read at this point almost exclusively others who have just sort of blown me away with their masteries over the years is technique. It really goes to craft and to technique. And I've, of course, I know how to write an essay, I know how to write a normal book, but I've always loved the architecture of the fragment. And I use architecture there very specifically. I write, like you said, and I love the term thought images there. I think it's perfect as an elucidation of what it is. There's a reason why, for me, I noticed this real young. Maybe I was too young to sort of be blinded at that point to certain things, because I wasn't looking at legitimate modes of writing. I noticed there's a reason why the most incendiary, provocative, cunning philosophers in the Western tradition, but it's always been in the Eastern traditions, that they gravitated gradually more and more toward aphorisms.
Aphorism, yeah.
So Kierkegaard starts going towards
Yes.
aphorism. Nietzsche, of course, Bataille, Blanchot, Baudrillard. And I started to realize they're onto something. Rather than dismiss that as some like elderly stage where they were, being lazy or being sort of flippant or trivializing things, I saw that dismissive approach in the academy towards aphoristic writing. But then I started realizing, no, some of the most crucial things are happening there. And it's precisely not in spite of the brevity or of the fragment, but because of it. So
Right.
first thing about that is that when you write a quick thought passage, like you just mentioned, a thought image kind of passage, is you're wrestling with impermanence from the get-go. Very clearly, you don't have a novel, you don't have a Dostoevsky in 700 pages, sort of to move. You're forced to negotiate from the outset a certain approach to speed, rhythm, and finitude by
Mm.
staying tightly bound in this transient slit of time. When you write something that you know is only going to be a page and a half sort of glance, as I structure, like you said, a lot of the text are these quick episodic movements in and out, infiltration and exit of a certain room. You can feel the trickling of the hourglass's sands. You can feel the countdown of that world that lives and dies in just a few paragraphs. So that's the first thing. And the second thing you mentioned with enclosure, you're absolutely right that there's a different logic of encapsulation in a writing like this than in an essay, and how the essay has certain frameworks and borders and beginnings and ends. The borders here are already half vanishing. You're always on the way, which means on the way out. You're always in the drift, which is, by the way, again, how fairy tales are structured. You're just moving from surfaces to surfaces, and you're in this isolated site that's meant for just a short while. The third reason I really like this methodology of these fragmentary sort of glimpses is that there's a multidimensionality that it allows for you to speak in the tongues and the masks of philosophy, again,
Mm.
mysticism, poetry, storytelling, even the enigmatic quality of prophecy can be
Mhm.
slipped in there. Um, so it's a more versatile armament of techniques that slip between, again, these many dialects and effects of writing. Lastly, I think that when you write something where you're going to transport someone into this radical elsewhere for just a few pages at a time and then immediately transport to another zone, you're playing the role of a map maker as well. And every line, therefore, is a cartography or a corridor that leads 3 steps ahead of the reader. Now, that's the tricky thing. What I like about it is, I'll be honest with you, the advantage I have over my reader to lead them through a kind of labyrinth. And this is not a politically correct thing to say in an age of the belief in equality. I know, and I do believe in equality in many levels, of course. But in this regard, at the aesthetic level, I love writers and artists who are manipulative.
Mhm.
I love being taken on a ride. I love being, sort of the plaything in the hands of a puppet master. And when you contrive and fashion and assemble passages like this, you have someone at your mercy to a certain extent. It doesn't have the presumption of being dialogic in an academic way, which I always thought was a fake anyway. There's
Right.
such a hierarchy of knowledge that goes on there. There's such a political gesture in that normalized form of writing. Here, at least, you're in the hands of the ringmaster of the circus, and that they're trying to generate glimpses at something, partial or peripheral visions, figments on the wall, and they're going to make the walls close in on the reader too. That's the last thing to generate. That takes a certain mastery of these shortened breath passages that to make a whole world close in on the reader just as they get out. So I would say, the sense that the continuum of possibility is narrowing and that you only have a few minutes left in this sector. I think that's part of the essence or the secret behind why I choose to write that way. Thank you for
It
asking.
reminds, of course, no, the technique and the form is really important because even in the production of the most elusive phenomena still resolve themselves in some sense. It's even in a moving sense, they still find, I think about historical memory is what it made me think about conceptually, how it's this like it is asymmetrical. It's asymmetrical in from an unlimited number of vantage points by which we are constantly being eluded because despite its own paradox, despite it being placed within the realm of the linear, we are eluding by removing linearity. And in a sense, rather than cohering in sort of a firm trajectory, being something coiling an idea or in and around itself and constructing something different. It made me think of now I wish I had pulled this part. It made me think of a couple of things that I engaging with your work. One was I read about it was some sort of you had a description of an art piece, I believe, that was made out of old reclaimed wood with these curving corridors you could never quite see the end of. Do you know
In
which one
Brazil,
I'm
yeah.
talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in
All this
Brazil. It was
debris and
Brazil.
wreckage of splintered beams that this artist had created an underground maze sort of halls. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think about production of knowledge much more in those terms than I do in the linearity of the archive. And instead, I find remarkable about your work is that it uses it uses that language, the framework, as a means for disrupting that sort of claimed particularity. And another work of yours that I would encourage anyone who's interested in, if they're interested in, the kinds of stuff we talk about on Zer0 now, I would encourage them to check out On the Side, which is it's essentially an anti-encyclopedia is the word that I have written on the front. When I summarize the book in the front of the book, I have that somewhere in my copy. It has it's a production, it's an epistemological object that by virtue of those that uses those epistemologies as a means for disrupting the way that we understand mania and how not just mania itself, but how we conceptualize and catalog mania as a series of epistemological consideration. I don't know if you have any
No,
thought on
no,
that
I think
one.
that's perfect. I in that book, which has some similar, similar because it's still my own strange compulsions sort of that drive them. In Omnicide, I chase, and by the way, part two is coming out as well in a
That's
couple of
right.
months, and that's the unfinished business of 137 other manias. Cataptromania, the obsession with mirrors; Zyromania, the obsession with razors; Thalassomania, the obsession with the sea. There's just and I just love this idea of some fugitive individual chasing some object of curiosity to the ends of the earth, even to fatal limits, where they'll plunge into the most treacherous depths just to try and catch, some contact with that. So I've always been interested in states of exception rather than the rule, which is what you were mentioning so nicely there. And for that, therefore, the criterion is different. Even though I'm a trained scholar, I did my academic training and I can move in those directions. There's, to me, and I don't want to be mean spirited, we're talking in affirmative ways, but there's a deep neurosis in academic writing. Sort of it's not necessarily
Yes.
just the footnoting that seems to just bury people alive in kind of over compensatory demonstrations of the totality of knowledge. Like I know this
Right.
thing back to front. For me, it's not my criterion to know Egyptian mythology better than anyone else, or to know futuristic cinema than anyone else, or to know Japanese death poetry better than anyone else. Of course, there are people walking the planet. That my criterion or my standard or my expectation of myself is, can I extract some twist
Mm.
there? And the question for also thought image passages, shortened writing bursts, and all of that is uh, that you have to know when to finish then. And that I always thought was one of the most graceful questions of craft for whether, again, it's Nietzsche or Blanchot. When do they know when they're done? If you're only writing, something that's seven lines or a page and a half, when do you know when it's done? It has to, And the criterion is not a cadence or conclusion. It's not a summation or a comprehensive kind of gesture that then rests everything in a universal claim. Instead, it has to hang on some dance of a twist, again, a turn of thought that is unexpected, that is unforeseen. So everything that I approach, I say, can I extract something strange from this? That someone at the end kind of just says, wow, that was a cool trick up his sleeve. I didn't think
Yeah.
he would take it there. And so that becomes the ruling prime directive for me,
Mm.
in composing these things. And Mania, just in that book, by the way, is just, it's a perfect, you're already dealing with people who are off, off the
Yeah.
grid, sort of out in the outskirts and outworlds of their own fascinations and their own compulsions. So things are already spiraling in phenomenal ways. I just have to go follow them, keep them company, and translate it into a philosophical language, essentially. But at any rate,
No, a worthy goal, particularly consider there is so much. It's what I've come to call spillage in experience. We have the rim by which we're accustomed to sort of like filling our reservoir of experience. I'm mixing lots of metaphors today, but it's fine. And then
nice.
we have that we've talked about excess. And I find that really interesting. I find it particularly compelling. It actually takes us into sort of the next thing that we were going to talk about today. It's as great as any time to get into the actual content of your book. So I have brought a passage from the first chapter/essay of Night Volume 2 titled Night and Space. I'd like to read it just a little bit for our viewers, and then I'll pose a question and I'll throw it back over to you. Chapter 1, Night and Space, 5 rooms at the end of the world. There are those nights of rare existence where certain rooms open to us, rooms of a more deranged intimacy where we can tempt the last boundary of experience to disappear forever. Thus, the art of disappearance begins from the construction of an interior space, a single shack, corner, underground, where we bisect ourselves into two opposing figures, the trespasser and the nemesis. Function of the trespasser, to steal power from this temporary domain. Function of the nemesis, to dissolve whoever enters into thin air. And it is night that stages this contest. It is in nocturnal hours alone that we seek the hiding place that turns us toward hiddenness itself. See, this is why I can't sleep. It's fine. It's good, even. I gotta make jokes. I can't help myself. These farthest rooms of the earth, built to suit the farthest nights of being, though their remoteness transpires right within our midst. I think that's a killer introduction to the bulk of the book. Let me find my notes. Here I am. The boundaries of nocturnal experience are very unique. If I might reach a little bit, they are necessarily elusive, which is why there's this sort of this very beautiful transgressive appeal, I think, involved in it. In this chapter, there's a sense that from night we can extract a unique time space that produces boundary expanding encounters. And I know your work frequently uses, as we were just discussing, frequently uses space and boundary and the like to push our imagination. I was wondering if you wanted to tell readers about your experience building and exploring spaces of possibility and what you may have gained from this. And if I may again, how this process appeals particularly to our senses and our experiences. I'm particularly drawn to a collaborative project of yours that was titled The House of Second Wisdom that came to mind immediately when I was re-engaging with this chapter. A sort of an imagined archival project. As a historian, the archive is always interesting to me. And to quote from that project, quote, where time and space fall under siege. So I was wondering if you would enlighten us as what it's like to produce these
Oh,
sorts of ideas.
thanks so much. I like listening to your descriptions better than my own, so thank you. I'm honored by that. I would say that, just something that caught my attention, just because you brought it up in that introduction. It's amazing how things recur, because I had to be quite honest with you. I had forgotten that I had dropped this conceptual idea of the nemesis in that
Mm.
chapter. And it's something that I'd just been writing about. And this is something for whoever might join us and keep us company and listen to this, that I'm sharing something that's unpublished and that's sort of I've never talked about because it's just being finished right now. But I actually went back to, so start with the connection to night. There's a great Mexican writer, Latin American writer that many people may know, Octavio Paz, who once said, there are certain nights where, I'm paraphrasing this, there are certain nights where I meet someone in an alley who wears my face as his mask. It's a very ominous sort of image. that he portrays there, and an encounter with someone who wears your face as their mask is a strange intersection. So
Right.
I started, to me, that's the figure of the Nemesis. So I started actually looking into the god Nemesis, who's a woman in ancient Greek mythology, and whose name literally means the one who gives what is due, the one who gives what is owed, or deals out shares of fortune as their due. And I looked, and I mean, very amazing things. Her graven images show her with grand white wings. Usually the Greeks don't have wings. She's often blindfolded and carrying a whip or a lash or a dagger or a scale. She had these cult grounds that were stationed by these archaic temples in southern Attica, and these weird festival rites that were practiced among gladiator circles in Rome. But what's
Right.
really fascinating to me, just to show you, because this goes into some of the method, when you look behind the scenes, I started to learn her very ominous family tree. So
Mm.
Nemesis, which often is associated with a figure of revenge or wrath, more correctly, she's first of all, her mother is Night, Nyx, and she has no father. So she's just sort of this protogenic deity Night gives rise to her, which is really cool. She's the sister to Hypnos, sleep,
Right.
Thanatos, the god of death, and Anadeia, ruthlessness, Epialis, nightmare, Geras, old age, Momus, scorn,
Mm.
Moros, doom, Aklis, death mist, Eris, discord, Alastor, blood feud, Eporia, want, Oisis, misery, Apate, deception. She's also the sister of the Onoroi, who are the thousand sons of the dream, the Caries, who are the thousand daughters of the cruel death, and the Moirai, the three sisters of the black fates, and the Nosoi, which are the gods of plague, and the Arai, the gods of curses as well. Just, I mean, amazing what these ancient cosmologies and mythologies, because I don't care about the question of belief, of whether or not actually these gods existed or not,
Right.
just the conceptual complexity of linking Night to Nemesis, to wrath, and then to, again, sleep, death, ruthlessness, nightmare, old age, death mist, doom, discord, blood feud. This is a phenomenal. I mean, this is what I'm hoping to do justice to the ancients, who I think superseded, our age of post enlightenment sort of kind of a segmentation into disciplines. So
Right.
when you go back so part of the way to honor this is precisely the you very graciously mentioned the current project, which is the one directly following Night. So these two books on Night took a lot out of me, a lot of scavenging and foraging the earth for weird tales and examples to bring forward, but also different
Mm.
reflections on Night to really write, for me, what was an exhaustive philosophy of Night,
Mm.
sort of at least self-exhausting, not exhaustive in terms of the topic. One could go on for thousands of pages. But then
Mm.
after it, I thought I need something different but the same. And so I started to
Mm.
collaborate, as you said, with a project that's happening right now, which has a nocturnal aspect to it, called the
Mm.
House of Second Wisdom, as you mentioned. And that's a collaboration with an absolutely ingenious, brilliant digital architect and computational designer, Asad Khan, who's originally from sort of an Afghani province of Pakistan. Just stunningly innovative. No one's used the technology, or he spent 7 years constructing an algorithm that no one has ever used before. Surveillance cameras, remote sensing radars, artificial intelligence. And it's all, though, in order to generate, as you said, a colossal, immersive, futuristic library, which is actually at the last threshold of the world, which is actually a speculative reawakening of an original house of wisdom. It's called the Beit al Hikmah of 8th century
Mm.
Baghdad. So,
Mm.
for those who don't know, the Beit al Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was this grand palace library of immense proportions, a sanctuary of books where the most visionary philosophers, scientists, astronomers, alchemists, inventors, calligraphers of the medieval era, they gathered together. There were books on optics and light. There were books on treatises on animals. I mean, just the most stunning texts that have ever been written.
Wow.
And it was burned down during the Mongol siege of 1258. Its endless illuminated manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris River. They say the Tigris River ran black with ink for 6 months straight because so
Mm.
many millions of volumes were tossed into the waters. So we're rescuing this lost image of a forsaken structure, resurrecting these tall shelves and spiraling corridors in order to form, and goes to your question, Kyle, in order to form a distorted hall of mirrors of the beyond. So it's extremely architectural, it's extremely engaged with space, but constantly breaking into zones. Every zone has its own catalog of books that have never been written. Every zone has its own imagery, its own tactility, its own sensations, its own objects. Some deal with candles, some have boxes, some have tables, some have necklaces or vials. different figures, the figure of the guardian, the widow, the madwoman, the messenger, and you can go on and on. Spaces, the arena, the labyrinth, the alleyway, a million things. So this is something that we're working with right now, a kind of cutting edge futural second breath of a house of wisdom that burned and drowned 1,000 years ago. So thanks for bringing that up. And if anyone wanted to actually see it, there are examples of the House of Second Wisdom on YouTube right now.
And we will link
We're
that.
in the process of going further.
Great. That's good to hear. I thought it was remarkable. I watched it a few times. It's very striking, the ability to create the necessary esotericism that's brought to these, like, the concreteness of lack in history, right? There's this sort of like, we've accepted that part of history is lost in the paradoxical sense of our constant attempts to sort of like refine and reflect on the absolute particularity of historical phenomena rather than examining the gap, so to speak. What came to mind for me, and we might have time to touch on the work of Bataille, but what particularly came to mind was the sort of the marriage of Bataille as a very esoteric figure who communicated in an invented political language. The sort of reconstructive idea of the famous Walter Benjamin's missing black suitcase, so to speak. We have this. There needs to be, my friend John, the co-host of our program on Zer0, John and I were joking about how we need to be writing esoteric fiction about Benjamin's missing black suitcase, because not just of the fact that it's an absent object, but that it's in interplay with the photocopy of the Arcades project that was left with Bataille, and as well as the sort of the potentials of the content of this object that is decidedly lost to history. I feel as though if we,
I would listen to that any day of the week, by the way, if you do end up talking about it. So
I'll email it to you. That'd be great. No, we gain an opportunity, and tell me if this makes sense. We gain opportunities by recognizing that even if someone walked up to my door, knocked on the door, and said, "I have Benjamin's missing black suitcase right here," and hands it to me, as far as I'm concerned, the construction of that object is still like that's not a closing off necessarily, but perhaps an illusion of daytime, if you will, like the Mirage, if you will, something along those lines.
No, I love that idea. And mirages are both manifestations, but they're also these amazing optical illusions that vanish, upon touch. And so even when you possess the black suitcase, it will find ways of evading, your grasp or your possession, which is why it's a wonderful sort of image. Especially, this is something that I kind of realized intuitively. When I was 18, I moved to New York City. And before I read Jean Baudrillard, I knew something, but then he gave me an elegant, stunning kind of philosophical language to understand it in depth, which is first time I walked into Times Square, and you just are bombarded with the neon lights and the fluorescence and these halogen lamps and billboards and movement and commotion and noise and just this sensory barrage from every angle, that's just sort of immersing you in this center of the world show, of screens and of images and advertisements. I suspected something. It's not like I had a repulsive, disenchanted view. I was mesmerized too. I'll admit it. The first time you're standing there, the lights are hitting you and there's this shock effect and wonderment. But I felt like it was hiding. It reeked of a cover-up to me of some kind. Because I had known enough about magic to know that the oldest trick of a magician is to show you their left hand up in order to pull off a trick with the right hand down there.
Right.
And so I was saying, why is it trying to show me so much? What is it concealing? What is it avoiding? What are the blind corners that are involved here? And that's precisely what figures like Baudrillard then became obsessed with trying to track, that in our age of toxic transparency, where we think everything is infinitely available. This goes to your point. I'm just improvising off of your points here, Kyle, that in an age where transparency has also become tragically the code word for freedom.
Yes.
Just has lost for me the more important criterion of freedom, which is secrecy. And I find it increasingly difficult to have great secrets, not just because of literally surveillance technologies and social media, that are constantly overexposing every tiny substance of thought or or image and all of that, and also erasing the border between interiority and exteriority, to the point that
Sure.
something like writing a diary at this point in history seems like it would be just anathema, some
Hmm.
anachronism or some obsolete kind of mode of privacy, when you can throw everything into the whirlpool of public consumption on on Twitter or on something like that. Why would you bother to
Right.
scrawl something in the dark that's only meant for you or meant for one other person? But to me,
Mm.
those are the most luxurious sort of items, those things sort of which are withheld, like you said, and that kind of dwell in those. This is that for me, again, the secret behind Nietzsche's subtitle to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book
Yeah.
for all and none,
Right.
meaning that he's not limiting who can enter there. It's not, he has no hierarchies of class or any of the other, gender, of a million things, or time period. Anyone could presumably sort of infiltrate and traverse into those realms, but probably no one will. And even if they
Mm.
do find themselves there, they'll be misled to a certain extent, because he makes sure to have lots of trapdoors and holes and confusions and all of that. And he does that with a sense of affirmation, not with sadism at all. So,
Now do all gushing fountains speak louder? Right.
there you go.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And so with Bataille too, who, by the way, was also infatuated with night, not
Yes.
just someone who wandered the streets of Paris at night, who formed a secret society that gathered at night that we might talk about briefly here, but also someone who constantly wrote about night in his own writing, just beautifully too.
I think secrecy is a. I think we can absolutely talk about secrecy. You discuss secrecy in the fourth chapter. Probably, I found the most. I'm always infinitely fascinated by the work of Bataille, as well as the work of Acefel more broadly, as it's. We're so invested in, as we've been talking about epistemology a lot. We're so invested. Apart, we're talking about sort of our experiences in academia and how they can often be very reductive, and how in Night as a book, and conceptually it exists as a counterpoint to discourses of enlightenment. These ideas of truth and absolutism and idealism become disrupted by conceptual foils and revealed in that paradox of Night. Like we've talked about before, in contrast to the more common expressions of Night, which is a chaos that doesn't know itself. Instead, you've rather explored the sophistication of the chaotic expressions of Night. It made me think initially of the discourses of violence that we discussed, as to find alternate terrains for the production of experience. But I think like the conceptual framework you put out in the book discussing Acefel as not just in the sort of typical understanding, our typical interpretation of Bataille's and etc. secret society, but the actual planes of experience. You talk about the terrain of
Mm-hmm.
the forest that they met in, for
Mm-hmm.
example. This ability to not just create a political language by identifying with almost forces of divinity, as well as this forces of unreason, if you will, but
Mm-hmm.
also in the step-by-step experiences of in the ambiguities of they had to walk a long way to get to
Well
their
said.
meeting point,
That's right.
right?
That's right. No, I love that you bring it up. And for those who may not be initiated in this
Mm,
short-lived experiment of the 1930s, George Bataille, who was a librarian, sort of, there was this grove in the back of the library where he decided to gather just some of the most phenomenal minds of that generation, but people who really felt, how should I put it, in despair. I mean, we have to think this was happening sort
mm,
of during world wars, the
yep,
age of world wars, and in despair over the just the reign of ideology and the sort of the dominance of these genocidal global conquering ideologies that were just killing entire cities at a time. And they felt an urgency to try something different, but instead of meeting it on some dialectical battlefield, and chanting kind of in response, they took to a weird tree struck by lightning in a grove in a forest, as you mentioned, far behind the library. And they started to experiment with rituals, with forms of writing, with ideas. And when you mentioned chaos, what I love about it is that it gave an opportunity, this acephalic movement that was only a few years. What it gave opportunity for was every writer who wrote in the acephalic movement did some of their most glorious work during that time period. It was
yep,
just an energetic, intensifying gathering zone for them.
yep.
But there's not a an amazing sense of continuity among
Mhm.
them. And so what I tried to get about is that, and by the way, it always happened at night, which is why it's part of the fourth chapter, sort of looking at this secret society that was formed at night. And by the way, I'll just say before I get into the original things of that, I've always thought that part of the reason why we philosophers, poets, artists, writers, whatever, creative types, dancers, sculptors, why we lose historically so often, why we fail to be able to match the onslaught, the progressive onslaught of everydayness and the tyranny of the same and power structures and regimes. I think it's because we fail to conspire enough. I
Mm.
really am a fan of conspiracy. And God knows political, economic, cultural, media, social forces exploit conspiracy constantly.
Our society of cultivated vulgarities.
There
Yes.
you go. There you go. And yet we don't conspire. The poets don't conspire enough. They don't have hidden cities. There
Mm.
aren't enough undergrounds or subterranean night readings and things like that. So I love the fact that there was this short breath of a time in the avant-garde time period, and it wasn't just Paris. It was around the world. The Persian avant-garde, the Japanese avant-garde, where they actually formed these kind of subterranean gangs, and these men and women just went, shot the moon, in terms of taking risks with their thinking and their writing at levels that we've never seen before. I wish there was more of that happening today.
Mm.
But just to give an example, I think there are 4 or 5 texts that I mentioned there in that chapter. Bataille himself, I look at precisely his obsession with the grove and with the lightning that struck this tree. But then you go to a weird piece called The Crucified by Henri Dusat, who's also part
Mm.
of that Asaphalic group. And he suddenly gets transported to Golgotha, the hill where Christ is crucified. And he's
Right.
standing before this offering, this sacred offering of a mutilated Messiah. And he's trying to sort of, in the midst of this simultaneously breathtaking and suffocating vision, he's trying to figure out sort of some secret ideas there that are phenomenal. Michel Léry, he takes us into an essay that, I mean, you couldn't get any different. His childhood home,
Mm.
and he
Right.
starts talking about how when his parents go to sleep at night, he walks through the house in the dark and things start to move weirdly. The oven he calls the radiant becomes this
Mhm.
effigy, becomes this iconic force that he stares at. Even his parents in the bed don't seem like his parents anymore. And
Right.
he doesn't call it this, but weirdly enough, in the text, he describes what later would be called Tard's delusion, which
Mm.
is that he starts to suspect that everybody is already dead,
Right.
and also Capgras delusion, which I love, which is the suspicion that everybody is an imposter wearing a fake
Uh,
face, and so it's an
right.
inability to recognize faces as authentic. And he gets this experience by just walking through his house at night when things just look slightly different in the dark. Roger Calois, one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, writes about festivals.
Mhm.
Um, and banquets for ghosts of the first days of the universe, and how it allows all kinds of role switching and shape shifting and suspension of taboo, and how you can
Mm.
stop the world from turning for that 1 week of the festival. And then I end with Nietzsche and the eternal return, because he's kind of the haunting ghost who's actually the inspiration for that secret society. But just to
Right.
show you again the sheer expanse and immensity of maneuvers and ideas that come out of this gesture to gather at midnight, in some forsaken grove. I just think that was amazing. But if you'll permit me to rant for just one more minute here,
Please.
actually, I'm going to let in the listeners on one thing that I'm looking at more closely now, and this even, to be honest with you, excites me slightly even more than the Asaphalic. No shot to them. They're brilliant. They're some of the greatest ever to traverse the earth. But a lot of people don't know is that a few years earlier, about 7 or 8 years earlier, from 1928 to 1932, in Reims, France, so not in Paris, a little bit of an offshoot city, 4 obscure youth formed a secret society that was also devoted to exploring the outer boundaries of the universal. And that was a movement later that was known as Le Grand Jeu, or the Great Game. And it was an inner circle who, now, they went to limits that the Asaphalics didn't. They experimented with drug visions, with near death
Mm.
experience, with anesthesia and writing under
Mm.
anesthesia. They ingested poisonous leaves of trees, strychnine, opium, carbon tetrachloride, which, if, for those who
Mm.
don't know, is a cleaning fluid and insect killer. They mastered sightless movement by bicycling through their rural town blindfolded. They attempted paroptic vision, which was to see hidden visual phenomena without using their eyes. So they would sit there with boxes, to mention your black suitcase. They would sit with a box and try to see if they could assess what was inside it. They practiced auto asphyxiation while writing. They held sharpened instruments against each other's throats while writing. They were 14 to 16, by the way, when they started this. I mean, it's just an unbelievable group of four ingenious youths. And one of my favorite things, they used to focus their gaze intensely on mirror surfaces for hours and hours until their own reflective image would blur and begin moving with strange ghostly autonomy. And so this was, I mean, and some of the figures are more well known of the four. René Daumal became a very famous mystical later. But actually, the one for me who's just so beautiful and brilliant and had tragically died young, the dark angel of the group, Roger Gilbert Lecomte. If anyone ever wants to read just someone who is staggering, died injecting himself with morphine, I think at age 32, putting a dirty syringe in his leg in a back room of a Paris bar where the owner, a nice old woman, had let him stay. And just very sad that he goes out that way. By the way, surrealism tried to appropriate them many times, tried to dominate them and bring them in because they were so fascinated by the work they were doing. And these 18-year-olds said no every time. They resisted. By the way, the surrealists conspired to destroy them. They used to buy all copies of their writing and burn them or throw them in the garbage so people couldn't read them. It was a sort of a sad thing to happen to these figures, but just such an intimate, powerful group of another secret society that gathered at night a little bit before the other ones. And their first text is called The Night Battle, actually, in case anyone's interested in that.
It's so fascinating to me. You mention you can see the sort of threads of childhood in those transgressive activities. I think about riding your bike with your eyes closed.
That's right.
Is the perfect sort of symbolic, sort of like playful act that persists beyond its anticipated life cycle, as so much of this sort of practice does. It subverts our ability to place it firmly within its temporal particularities, and rather enters into this broader conversation involving the body, I think in particular, which is so incredibly useful and I think fascinating.
Can I say something to that? Because this great point you bring
Yes.
up with the child's imagination. There was I think it may be an unpublished article to this day. I had the distinct privilege of being a student of Michael Taussig, who was a well-known anthropologist. And he once told us that he had been working for years on a piece and he hadn't published it then, probably published it later, many years later, but called The Adult's Imagination of the Child's Imagination. And what he was warning against was the overproduction of Disney-esque, Twilight-esque, Harry Potter-esque sort of fantasy movies, even Lord of the Rings, that are from very talented, fantasy writers. But nevertheless, we should never forget, these are not accurate representations of the child's imagination. This is the adult's imagination of the child's imagination. Yeah. And that's why they often degenerate in the end. Even the best ones degenerate into moral stories, into good and evil, hero tales, and archetypes. And so then what he was trying to get at was the more mercurial, more nebulous, more occluded dimension of what would the child's imagination actually look like in those fairy tale structures where maybe an adult author got it right, was maybe closer to actually the attunement, you know what I mean, or the wavelength of the child's actual imagination. And it starts with the fact that we have to realize, whether it's Where the Wild Things Are or it's Alice in Wonderland, it starts from an infuriation and an outrage and a sense of offense that the child has to the claustrophobic boredom of our adult reality. They're escaping the day or the surface, of our rules, of our bad psychologies, of our sort of stale networks, and customs and routines and habits and all that. And they'll go anywhere. They'll chase a rabbit down a rabbit hole. They'll go to another island where there's monsters. Little Red Riding Hood will go into a forest of predatory species who want nothing more than to devour her. Or Hansel and Gretel will go face witches, cannibal witches, anything just to get away from us.
Right.
That's how fatigued and disgusted they are with the adult machine. And so we have to start with that offense that they even are willing to risk fatal danger just from the sheer exhaustion of the sameness that they experience, from our side of things. So I think that's a starting point. And by the way, again, it's no coincidence that so much of children's literature that gets it right is nocturnal. The lullaby is a nocturnal genre. To
Right.
start with, the bedtime story is a nocturnal genre. But so many fairy tales also are night stories. And there's something to that. So I just wanted to play off of what you were unraveling there.
I think it's remarkable, the idea that the use of the interplay and imagination and our interpretation of a dream state or a nightmarish state, and how so much of what we're attempting to do is to capture that quote unquote authentic sense of imagination, in the same way that we're always trying to, rather than we're always trying to interpret our one for one representation of the dream or the nightmare, rather than attempting to, excuse a term that I use frequently, wake up within the dream and emerge with the realm of one for one representation, which is actually closer to the intrinsic ambiguities of that sort of childlike play, right? Rather than moralizing, or than placing the constraints of contemporary discourse on the child who conquers the anthill, if you will. The child just conquers the anthill. And what does this mean, rather than an additional sort of a series even of removals from the particular temporalities of that experience?
Well said. This could deviate us into really cool compartments of thought. George Bataille, who we mentioned earlier, he wrote a great piece called The Formless.
Mm,
And he was intrigued by the possibility. I mean, it's more intricate than just this, but could we ever escape, our world of forms, the way that we have been formed, that we've been
right.
conditioned, the way that identity has been carved and chiseled and tattooed onto our consciousness, to the
Mm,
extent that, I mean, we think we say I, but how much of I is really they?
yeah.
And we have to be deeply suspicious of the fact that probably the vast majority, almost every thought we have, belongs to the they. And
Yeah.
the they is not actually a personification, it's just systems of thought, discourses, like you said, language games, which have the advantage on this because they've got thousands of years of buildup. And they get us early, they get us right from the get go. There never is an I before there's a they. From
Yeah.
day one, they're attributing sort of, titles and categories and classifications. And so Bataille was really intrigued by those moments, those possibilities of the summit or the extreme limit of experience where you could become formless again.
Mm,
Interestingly, a counterpart of his, but someone who they didn't intersect either in the mind or historically very much, Deleuze, was
mm,
interested in the unformed.
yeah.
And the unformed for him, he saw either in the schizophrenic or the child. Interestingly, weird thing, Deleuze noted that schizophrenic writers like Antonin Artaud
Mm,
hated Alice in Wonderland, absolutely hated Alice in Wonderland, and actually, weirdly though, accused Lewis Carroll of time traveling to his time and plagiarizing it from Artaud. So Artaud both condemned Alice in Wonderland but claimed to be the actual author of it too. Weird thing. But Deleuze was really curious as to why he loved Artaud's writing and he loved Alice in Wonderland, and Artaud hated Alice in Wonderland. And
right.
just on some weird, intuitive, spontaneous, impulsive, temperamental level, his schizophrenic imagination could not bear or consume the child's imagination of Alice
Mm,
in Wonderland. And he figured it out eventually. And it has to do with something of the logic of the unformed, how they're different approaches to the question of the unformed. The mad or the lunatic and the child just have but they're both part of that, the unformed, rather than the formless and Bataille. But Nietzsche's got this cool little phrase in Beyond Good and Evil where he calls for a second dangerous innocence.
mm,
And that always stuck with me. I always thought that was one of the most elegant juxtapositions. The second dangerous innocence, meaning that the first innocence, that of the child, is stunning, is striking, is charming and alluring, but it's also very fragile and it gets stolen quick. It gets damaged, it gets dominated, it gets thieved from traumatically. So he's wondering how you get to that second dangerous innocence, and he's hanging his whole destiny on the potentiality of uncovering some recipe to concoct to get to the second dangerous innocence, which Bataille will call the extreme limit, which Deleuze will call the body without organs, which, everybody's got a name for it. I've got my own too. Will to power, Nietzsche will call it at some point. But there's something to that, and it has to do with what we're talking about. So when you said the dream, even, one of the things about psychoanalysis, for all of its genius, some people may read Omnicide and notice that it's an all-out war against psychoanalysis too. It's really going for the jugular vein of that movement. That is out of my awe and respect for the generative brilliance and genius of the early psychoanalysts who created an entire world of thought for us.
Yeah.
I don't discredit that. What it took, the sheer ambitiousness of the task, and they gathered all the time to talk about secret societies, except they weren't very secret. They called themselves formalized associations, while others were laughing at them for their formality, because they were looked at as witch doctors and sorcerers early on. But they were having these meetings until the midnight hours, interpreting each other's dreams. It's well known that Freud and Jung used to interpret each other's dreams together. The problem became when interpretation started to resemble an absolute law to them.
Right.
And so Freud thought he was getting it right, which is when he started stumbling into a form of truth-telling. And it was already predicted in the fact that he saw himself more as a scientist than as a visionary sort of, storyteller. For sure, he wanted to get to the essence and the truth of things. And what it ends up doing is restricting a lot of his flexibility eventually. Because I get it, and I've said this before, when you've listened to 727 different schizophrenic accounts of talking with divinities, eventually you have to just stop the valve from gushing and start to form a school around it. And for that, you need organized, coherent principles. The problem is the schizophrenics aren't stopping to produce new visions. It's just he can't contain them anymore. Otherwise, he'll just be drowning in a Pandora's box of whimsical imagery that doesn't lead to anything. Right. Except just proliferation, endless proliferation. So he has to stop listening after a while to the voices in the head and write interpretation of dreams and try and categorize and classify and taxonomy. And that's why, it starts to kind of spell its own end at that moment when it tries to structure itself, in those ways. So I'm trying to be on the side of the mad and on the side of the child and on the side of the strange wanderers who I just let them keep going. And I go with them as far as I can. So, at any rate,
I think that's as good of a place as any to say if you have any final thoughts, if you'd like to point anyone toward anything in line or plug anything or what have you, feel free to fire away.
Well, no, I'm grateful for anyone who picks up any of these scattered words and ideas. I do try to put everything I have into them. There's a sincerity, at least, as much as I adore deception and illusions and great liars, there is a genuine nature to what I do. I try to bleed in these texts as much as I can, put myself on the line in them. So I'm thankful to anyone who does stumble their way into these clearances. These books on night, they've taken a lot out of me, many sleepless nights of my own, many sort of, spending up writing them, trying to be as eloquent a representative and guardian of night as I could. And yes, if something beyond this, if people are already familiar with the Night Project, you had kindly mentioned the Omnicide Project, which is my 2-volume study of madness, different kinds of mania and madness, and also an apocalyptic kind of aspect to that. And then the ever-emerging, evolving project of the House of Second Wisdom, which has that visual, multimedia, multidimensional component of forming an actual, like you said, archive lost in time and space. Sort of the last library on earth, if anyone's interested in traveling there. But thank you so much, Ka, by the way, as well, for indulging.
It was a pleasure. For all who are interested, just go to the description, look for links, and Night Volume 2 of Philosophy of the Last World will be out later this summer from Zer0 Books. Jason, thank you very much for joining me. I had a blast.
Much appreciated. Same here.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.